God just activated a wealth shift in your life. Something massive just changed. Let me ask you something before I say another word. What if the very moment you pressed play on this, the very second your eyes found these words, was not an accident? What if I told you that God does not operate on coincidence, that there is no such thing as stumbling into a message that was written with your name embedded in every syllable? What if I told you that right now, at this exact hour of your life, heaven has opened a file with your name on it, and the verdict that just came down from the throne room of eternity is not punishment, not delay, not another season of waiting, but activation, because that is what is happening right now to you, not to the person sitting next to you, not to the one who has been serving God longer, praying louder, fasting harder, to you, the one who almost didn't read this, the one who has been quietly wondering if God forgot your address, the one who has been watching everybody else walk into their breakthrough while you've been standing at the door, key in hand, wondering why the lock won't turn. It just turned. And before you go any further, if this message is already speaking to the marrow of something you've been carrying, do me one thing. Subscribe. Share this. Because somebody in your circle is one word away from the shift that changes the trajectory of their entire bloodline. And that word might be living inside this very message. Don't let them miss it because you kept it to yourself. Now let's go deeper. Let's go somewhere most motivational speeches are too afraid to go. Isaiah 43:19 says this, "Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it?" Do you understand the violence hidden inside that verse? God is not saying, eventually I will do something new. God is not saying one day when you've earned it, when you've cleaned yourself up, when you've read enough chapters and prayed enough hours. He is speaking in the present continuous tense. Now it springs forth. Right now, while you're broken. Right now, while the bank account is low. Right now, while the relationship is crumbling. Right now, while the diagnosis sits on the table and your faith feels like a crumpled piece of paper. Now it springs forth. The question God is asking, and it's a confrontational question, an almost aggressive question, is, do you not perceive it? That is the indictment. Not that God isn't moving. Not that heaven is silent. The problem is perception. The problem is that most people have calibrated their spiritual eyesight to see only what has been, and so they completely miss what God is doing in the now. Let me explain what I mean by a wealth shift.
We have reduced wealth to money, and that reduction has cost us everything. We stand in our financial deserts praying for rain while God has already redirected the river, but because we are only looking up at the sky, we never look down and realize we're standing on the riverbank. Wealth in the Hebrew understanding, shalom, in its fullest biblical meaning, is a state of nothing missing, nothing broken, completeness, wholeness. Not just money in the account, but clarity in the mind, peace in the body, fire in the purpose, alignment in the relationships, authority in the spiritual dimension. When God activates a wealth shift, He is not just writing you a check. He is restructuring the entire architecture of your life from the inside out.
And here is what is terrifying and beautiful at the same time. You cannot manufacture it. You cannot hustle your way into it. You cannot network your way into it. You cannot vision board your way into it. When God decides to shift something in your life, it is a sovereign act. It comes from outside the system of human effort and human limitation. and it arrives at a time that makes no logical sense, so that when it comes, nobody gets the glory but God. That's why it always shocks people. Let me ask you a different kind of question now. A question that might disturb something comfortable inside you. Why do you think you're here reading this right now? Not philosophically, not rhetorically, genuinely. What chain of events led you to this exact moment? What door closed that forced you to stop? What failure redirected your steps? What loss made you desperate enough to look for a word? Because I want to suggest something that the human mind almost never accepts. What you experienced as a loss was actually a launch. What you called a closed door was actually God locking you out of a room that He knew would eventually burn down, so that you would be standing outside when the right door opened. Jeremiah 29:11, and I know you've heard this verse so many times it has lost its edge, so let me give it back its teeth, says, "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." But do you know the context of that verse? Do you know who he was talking to? He was talking to people in captivity. He was writing a letter to exiles, people who had been ripped from everything they knew, dragged to a foreign land, surrounded by a culture that did not honor their God, stripped of their temple, stripped of their homeland, stripped of their identity. And in the middle of that, not after it was over, not from the other side of the breakthrough, in the middle of the Babylonian captivity, God says, "I know the plans I have for you, plans for welfare, plans for a future," which means God specializes in speaking destiny into the middle of devastation, which means the wealth shift does not wait for the perfect circumstances. It does not wait for the storm to be over. It does not wait for you to feel ready. It arrives in the middle of the mess, and it starts working from the inside, restructuring, repositioning, reassigning, long before the external evidence catches up to the internal transformation. You might be in your Babylon right now, but God just sent you a letter. Now I want to talk about something that nobody is willing to address in these kinds of messages, and that is the cost of elevation. People want the shift, but they don't want to confront what the shift requires them to release. Every time God has activated a wealth shift in the biblical record, there was always a moment of surrender that preceded the surge. Not a small surrender, not a comfortable one, a gut-wrenching, identity-threatening, everything on the altar kind of surrender. There was a moment when a widow in Zarephath had only enough oil and flour for one final meal. She was preparing to eat it, feed her son, and then die. And in that moment, a prophet showed up and asked her to give it away first. Give the last thing you have before you feed yourself, before you save your son. Give it to God first. And she did. And the Bible says the oil and the flour did not run out, not for a day, not for a week, for the entire duration of the famine. 1 Kings 17, read it. Now here's what I need you to understand about that story that gets glossed over in every Sunday school version. That widow had a choice. She could have looked at the prophet and said, "Are you insane? I have nothing. I am at the end. You want me to give you my last?" And she would have been justified by every human standard of logic. But she chose to release the thing that she was holding on to for survival. And in releasing it, she was released into supernatural provision. The question I have to ask you directly is, what are you holding on to so tightly that your white-knuckled grip is actually blocking the very provision you're praying for? Because sometimes the delay is not God's hesitation. Sometimes the delay is our grip. Luke 6:38, give, and it will be given to you, good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you. That verse is not just about money, it is about everything. Give away the bitterness, and you will receive a peace that surpasses understanding. Give away the need for control, and God will give you authority over things that you could never have managed through control. Give away the smaller version of the dream, and God will give you back something that doesn't fit in the container you are holding. The wealth shift that God is activating right now is not a reward system. It's not a prosperity transaction. It is a divine repositioning, and divine repositioning always requires that you let go of the old position to occupy the new one. You cannot stand in two places at once. You cannot receive the new thing with your hands full of the old thing. Let me say that one more time, because some people need to hear it twice. You cannot receive the new thing with your hands full of the old thing. What is in your hands right now that needs to be released? What relationship has expired but you won't let it go? What version of yourself are you defending that God is trying to let die so the real you can emerge? What limiting belief are you calling wisdom when it is actually just fear dressed in theological language? I want to shift now because there is something happening in the invisible dimension that most people never talk about. And it directly affects what happens in the visible dimension of your finances, your health, your relationships, and your purpose. There is a concept in Ephesians 6:12 that Paul doesn't let us ignore. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Here is what that means in the language of the wealth shift. The reason your breakthrough has been resisted is not because you aren't good enough. It is not because God is punishing you. It is because there are forces in the spiritual dimension that understand what you carry, that understand the assignment on your life and the territory that assignment would take from the kingdom of darkness. And those forces have been strategically attacking the gates of your breakthrough to keep you in a cycle of almost, not quite, right around the corner, maybe next year. But when God activates a wealth shift, He does not just move money. He moves the resistance. He silences the spiritual interference. He reassigns the gatekeepers. What was being blocked is suddenly cleared. What was being hindered is suddenly accelerated. And people around you will look at your life and not be able to explain what happened, because what happened did not happen at the level that human eyes can see. This is why Psalm 105:37 says something extraordinary about the children of Israel coming out of Egypt. Then he brought out Israel with silver and gold, and there was none among his tribes who stumbled. They came out wealthy. Not one of them stumbled. After 400 years of slavery, not one was sick, not one was crippled, not one was left behind, and they came out with the wealth of the nation that had enslaved them. God had downloaded the wealth shift so thoroughly, so completely, that the people who had everything were funding the exit of the people who had nothing. Think about that. The wealth of your enemy can become the seed of your expansion. The very system that held you back can become the vehicle that launches you forward, but only when God is the one orchestrating the shift. Now let me talk to someone who is reading this and has been faithful for a long time. You have been praying, you have been giving, you have been serving, you have been trusting, and there are days when you wonder if any of it is registering. Days when you look at people who seem to have no spiritual discipline at all, who seem to be living without God in any real sense, and yet they appear to be thriving, and a quiet question rises in your soul that you are almost ashamed to acknowledge. Is this real? Is God actually watching? Is faithfulness actually worth it? I hear you, and more importantly, God heard you before you even formed the question. Galatians 6:9, and let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap, if we do not give up. In due season. Not in your season. Not in the season you planned. Not in the season that makes sense to your 5-year projection. In due season, which means the season that is owed to you, the season that has your name written on it in heaven, the season that was assigned before the foundation of the earth. And the only thing that separates you from that harvest is the decision not to quit before you get there. The enemy knows the exact moment your breakthrough is scheduled. He has been counting down to it just like heaven has, and his entire strategy is to exhaust you, discourage you, humiliate you, wear you down in the final hours before the shift occurs, because if he can get you to walk away from your post 10 minutes before the shift activates, you miss the entire harvest, which means the very weight you feel right now, the exhaustion, the doubt, the quiet desperation, is not evidence that God has forgotten you. It is evidence that you are close. The pressure is highest right before the breakthrough because the enemy is throwing everything at you to get you to stop before God throws the switch. Don't stop. Let me ask you something that might feel uncomfortable. Do you actually believe you are worth God's best? Not theoretically. Not in the part of your brain where you store church answers. In the gut. In the place where decisions actually get made. Do you believe, really believe, that God looks at your life and sees someone worthy of abundance, worthy of health, worthy of love that doesn't hurt, worthy of purpose that sets the world on fire? Because here is the truth that many people never admit. The ceiling on their blessing is not the sovereignty of God. It is the poverty of their own self-perception. God cannot pour a river into a thimble. And when you have spent years convincing yourself that you are a thimble, through abuse, through failure, through disappointment, through the words of people who should have built you up but tore you down instead, you unconsciously cap the amount of blessing you allow yourself to receive. Romans 8:17 calls you a co-heir with Christ. Not a servant, not a spectator, not someone who gets the leftovers after the real heirs have been served. A co-heir, equal access to everything that belongs to the Son. And Romans 8:32 asks this rhetorical question that God himself is posing to the doubting parts of your soul. He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? The logic of that verse is devastating to every argument your insecurity has ever made. If the greatest gift in the universe, the life of the Son of God, was given for you, then what exactly is too much for God to add? What exactly is beyond what God is capable or willing to give to someone he paid that price to redeem? What blessing is too large? What shift is too dramatic? What turnaround is too sudden? None of them. None of them is too much. The giving of the Son was not the minimum. It was not the last resort. It was the declaration of what you are worth to God. And nothing you have done since then has changed that valuation. Proverbs 10:22, the blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow with it. I want to stay here for a moment because this verse confronts one of the most destructive lies ever preached in the church. The lie that suffering is the currency of spiritual maturity, that the more you suffer, the more God is pleased, that abundance is somehow suspect, that prosperity is always a sign of compromise. Now let me be clear. I am not preaching a faith that ignores the cross, that bypasses the cost of discipleship, that sells you the idea that following Jesus means a life free of trial. Jesus himself said in John 16:33, in this world you will have trouble. Not might, will. That is a guaranteed reality of human existence. But there is a profound difference between the trials that come because you are carrying a kingdom assignment, the opposition that is the byproduct of your impact, and the poverty that comes from believing that God wants you diminished, between the suffering that builds character and the deprivation that comes from a misunderstanding of God's nature. The blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow with it, which means the wealth that God releases into your life is not the kind that destroys your family, corrupts your soul, and empties your chest while filling your bank account. It is the kind that makes you whole, that builds something that lasts, that creates a legacy your great-grandchildren will still be walking in. That is what is being activated right now. Not a windfall that vanishes, not a season of abundance followed by a crash that leaves you worse than before. A permanent repositioning, a new baseline, a line in your history that future generations will look back on and say, everything changed when they aligned with God. Everything changed in that season. Something shifted and it never shifted back. Let me spend a moment on the mechanics of how God moves in a wealth shift. Because if you understand the pattern, you will stop missing the moments when God is engineering your breakthrough. First, God almost always uses the ordinary to deliver the extraordinary. He doesn't typically send an angel with a suitcase full of cash. He sends a conversation with a stranger at a moment you weren't expecting to have it. He sends a thought at 3 a.m. that becomes the idea that changes everything. He sends an email from someone you haven't spoken to in years with an opportunity you didn't know existed. He opens a door in the back of a building you walked past 100 times without noticing. The reason most people miss their wealth shift is that they are waiting for something that looks miraculous, while God is engineering something that looks ordinary, because God moves in ways that require faith to recognize and courage to respond to. 2 Kings 4. The widow in debt, about to lose her sons to creditors. Elisha asks her, "What do you have in your house?" Not, "What do you wish you had?" Not, "What are you praying for?" "What do you have?" She says almost dismissively, "Nothing but a small jar of oil." And that jar of oil becomes the seed of her entire financial liberation. God almost always starts with what is already in your house. The talents you've been minimizing, the idea you've been dismissing as too simple, the gift you've been embarrassed by because it doesn't look impressive enough, the resource you've been hoarding in fear when it was designed to be a seed. Second, God almost always uses people you didn't expect as the vehicles of your shift. The angel doesn't usually show up in a white robe. It usually shows up in the form of a mentor who says the right thing at the right time, a connection that seems random, a recommendation from someone who barely knows you, a stranger who sees in you what you cannot see in yourself. Acts 3, 2-6. A lame man at the gate called Beautiful, begging for money. Peter and John walk by. The man asks for silver and gold. Peter says, "Silver and gold I do not have, but what I have I give to you. In the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, rise up and walk." He didn't get what he asked for. He got something unimaginably greater. He asked for enough to survive the day. He received the ability to walk for the rest of his life. And I need to pause on that because somebody reading this has been asking God for a very specific thing, a specific amount, a specific opportunity, a specific person. And God is about to give you something so much greater than what you asked for that you won't even miss the thing you were praying for. What you thought was the blessing was actually just enough to survive. What God is releasing is enough to thrive for the rest of your life and beyond. Third, the shift almost always requires a public act of faith before the private miracle becomes visible. The lame man had to try to stand before his legs were healed. The disciples had to cast the net before the fish filled it. The widow had to start pouring before the oil multiplied. There is almost always a moment where you have to act on what you believe before you have any physical evidence that the belief is warranted. This is why so many people miss their wealth shift. They are waiting for the evidence to show up before they take the step. But faith, by definition, is the act of moving toward what you cannot yet see. Hebrews 11:1, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith is not the feeling that everything will work out. It is the decision to move forward despite the feeling that it won't. And it is that decision, that act of courage in the face of fear, that step toward the impossible, that activates the supernatural. I want to shift into something that is going to challenge the way you've been thinking about where you are right now. You have been reading your current situation as a setback. What if it's actually a setup? What if the job you lost was God's way of removing you from a trajectory that would have eventually crushed you? What if the relationship that ended was God's act of protection, not abandonment? What if the business that failed was God's way of teaching you everything you needed to know about how to build the one that would succeed? What if the years that felt wasted were actually years that were being invested, building in you a depth of character that would be required to steward the magnitude of what is coming? 2 Corinthians 4:17 says, for this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. The word preparing is key. The affliction is not pointless. It is not random. It is preparing something. It is building something inside you that will be necessary when the weight of the glory lands on your life. Because glory, real, sustained, generational glory, requires roots. And roots are built in darkness underground, in the places where nobody is watching, in the seasons that look like nothing is happening. What looks like nothing is happening right now is actually the most important thing that has ever happened in your story. Deuteronomy 8:18, but remember the Lord your God, for it is he who gives you the ability to produce wealth, and so confirms his covenant, which he swore to your ancestors as it is today. He gives you the ability to produce wealth, not the wealth itself handed to you on a platter. The ability, the creativity, the insight, the connections, the right idea at the right time, the energy, the favor, the door-opening power, the mind that sees what others miss, the wisdom to act when others hesitate, the resilience to continue when everyone else has quit. When God activates a wealth shift, he doesn't just drop resources from the sky. He upgrades the person. He upgrades the mind. He upgrades the perception. He upgrades the network. He upgrades the anointing. He upgrades the boldness. And an upgraded person in the same environment produces completely different results, which means the shift has already started inside you, right now, if you're willing to receive it. The internal upgrade precedes the external evidence by months, sometimes years. But if you pay attention, you can feel it happening, a new clarity, a new hunger, a new sense of direction, a new willingness to take the risk, a new ability to see opportunity where before you only saw obstacle. That is not self-help. That is not positive thinking. That is the Spirit of God doing interior renovation, preparing the vessel to carry what is coming. Job 42:10, after everything, after the loss of everything Job had, after the pain that defied explanation, the suffering that made no logical sense, the silence of heaven that felt like abandonment, and the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. The Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before. Twice as much, not restored to the original level. not brought back to the starting point. Twice as much. God's idea of restoration is not returning you to zero. It is not giving back exactly what was taken. His idea of restoration is addition, multiplication, amplification. When God brings you back, he brings you back better. When God rebuilds what was destroyed, he builds it bigger. When God repays what was stolen from you, he repays it with compounded interest. I want to speak directly to the person who has been through something that felt like it should have ended you. The loss that would have been reasonable to quit after, the betrayal that would have justified never trusting again, the failure that would have made permanent retreat understandable. You are still here. That is not by accident. That is not just your stubbornness or your resilience, though God uses those. That is the hand of God sustaining a life that has a purpose that the enemy could not abort and that suffering could not extinguish. You are still here because God is not finished with you. And what is coming, the twice as much on the other side of this season, is so significant that every attempt to destroy you in advance was worth the enemy's full investment. The magnitude of the attack tells you something about the magnitude of the assignment. Now let me close with this, because everything I've said, every verse, every challenge, every question has been building to this one final truth. The wealth shift is not primarily about what God is going to do for you. It is about what God is going to do through you. Ephesians 3:20. Now to him who is able to do far more abundantly than all that we ask or think, according to the power at work within us. According to the power at work within us. Not above us. Not despite us. Within us. God's plan is not to build something over your head that you watch from below. His plan is to build something through you, using your hands, your voice, your mind, your story, your scars, your gifts, your resources, so that the world around you is transformed by the overflow of what God has placed inside you. The wealth shift you're being called into is not for you to sit on. It is for you to steward. It is for you to deploy. It is for you to use as a weapon against poverty and the people around you, against despair in your community, against the lie that God has forgotten the broken and the overlooked and the ones the world has written off. You are being repositioned to be a pipeline, not a pool, to be a distribution center, not a storage facility. And when God finds someone who is willing to be that, willing to let the blessing flow through them instead of hoarding it, he opens the heavens over that person's life in ways that cannot be contained, cannot be explained, cannot be attributed to anyone's intelligence or strategy or effort. Matthew 6:33, the most audacious promise in the entire New Testament. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. All these things. Not some. Not the things you deserve. Not the things that fit your current level. All these things added. When you put the kingdom first, when the expansion of God's purposes becomes the organizing principle of your life, when you stop building your kingdom and start advancing his. The wealth shift is already in motion. It was set in motion before you understood what was happening. God has been positioning, aligning, and preparing everything that has your name on it. And today, something crossed a threshold. Something in the invisible dimension was declared complete. A season ended. A new one opened. And the evidence will begin to appear in your physical world with a speed and a scale that will shock even your faith. Your job right now, your only job, is to receive it, to believe it before you see it, to act on it before the evidence supports it, to give thanks for it before it arrives, and to hold it loosely when it does, knowing that it came through you, not from you, and that its purpose always extends beyond you. Something massive just changed. God just activated a wealth shift in your life. And the best chapter of your story, the one that you will one day read aloud to your children and their children, with tears running down your face, that chapter begins today, right here, right now. Receive it. If this message moves something inside you, do not keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Someone in your life is one word away from the shift that changes everything. And that word might be the one you just read.